The plan was simple enough: clear the rubbish, reclaim the ground, get on with it. Margaret Hollis had inherited Brackfen Farm from her uncle 18 months earlier, and she had spent the first year sorting the accounts, repairing the fences, and learning which fields drained properly and which turned to soup every time it rained. The farmhouse itself was sound. The main barn was structurally fine once she replaced 4 rotten roof purlins, but the ground behind the barn, a rough rectangle of roughly 30 feet by 45, running along the back wall and down toward the old hawthorn boundary, was, by any honest measure, a disgrace. She hadn't touched it in all that time. There hadn't been a reason to. It wasn't visible from the lane. It wasn't harming anything, and there were always more pressing things to be done on a working farm than confront a pile of inherited junk that had been accumulating quietly for 4 decades. What changed her mind was drainage. The field immediately beyond the hawthorn boundary, Lower Fallow she'd taken to calling it, had a persistent problem with standing water in the northeast corner. She'd had an agricultural drainage consultant out in early spring, a methodical man from Shrewsbury who spent 2 hours walking the field with a probe and a clipboard before concluding that the original land drains running from the back of the farm were almost certainly blocked or collapsed, and that whatever infrastructure had once managed the flow of water from that side of the barn was not doing its job any longer. To properly investigate, let alone repair, she would need clear access to the ground behind the barn. And so, on a dry Thursday in late April, she started clearing. If you love forgotten places and the stories buried beneath them, subscribe. There are more of these waiting. And leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. It's always a surprise how far these stories travel. What she found in the first few hours was exactly what she'd expected: a concentrated archaeology of agricultural neglect. Nearest the barn wall, half buried under a skin of moss and compacted leaf litter, were the remains of what had once been a set of timber sheep hurdles, now collapsed flat and rotted to a soft brown pulp. On top of those lay several sections of corrugated galvanized sheeting, the kind used for decades on British farms to repair holes in outbuildings, cover pits, or improvise shelters for ewes during lambing. Most of the sheets were buckled, rust streaked through, and no longer good for anything. Beyond that, a rusted-out diesel drum with no lid. 3 coils of barbed wire, brittle and dangerous, tangled together with a length of old baler twine into a single matted mass. The frame of a chain harrow, the tines snapped off at irregular intervals, the wheel assembly from a piece of equipment she couldn't immediately identify, possibly an old muck spreader or a seed drill, though the axle had sheared and the hub was cracked clean through. She moved methodically, working from the barn wall outward, loading salvageable metal onto the telehandler bucket for the scrap merchant and dragging the rotten timber to a separate pile for burning. As she worked deeper into the accumulated heap, the layers became older. The junk near the surface was from the 1990s, she guessed, recognizable by the particular grade of plastic twine and the style of the drum fittings. Beneath that, the equipment had a different weight and character to it: cast iron rather than pressed steel, forged rather than welded. She turned up the rusted carcass of an old Lister engine, the portable kind used to run water pumps and generators on farms that hadn't been on the national grid, and a clutch of old cast iron weights, of the sort that had once hung from a weighbridge beam. Each object represented a decision: deal with this later. Later had arrived, it turned out, roughly 40 years after it was first postponed. By mid-afternoon, she had cleared approximately 2/3 of the area. The ground beneath was pale and compressed, almost chalky in places, starved of light for so long that nothing had grown on it. She could see traces of what had once been a path of some kind, not a formal path but an area where the earth had been worn down by regular foot traffic, running roughly perpendicular to the barn wall. She noted it, but didn't stop. She wanted to reach the hawthorn boundary before the light went. She removed a final rusted section of cast iron gate, balanced awkwardly against a heap of broken concrete blocks, and dragged it clear of the area. Then she saw it. A straight edge. Not the rounded edge of a concrete slab, not the meandering line of a buried curb. A deliberately cut, carefully laid straight edge of flat stone, running along the ground at an angle she hadn't anticipated. She crouched down and brushed away the loose soil with her hand. The stone was dressed. Not rough field stone, not broken rubble. It had been shaped. She cleared more earth. Another surface appeared below it. Then another. She stopped, stood up, looked at what she was seeing. They were steps, stone steps descending into the ground behind a barn, 3 of them visible, possibly more beneath the remaining compacted soil at the base of the pile. Each step approximately 2 feet wide and perhaps 9 inches deep, constructed from what looked like local sandstone, the warm, reddish-brown variety common to this part of South Shropshire. The risers were cleanly cut. The treads had a slight forward pitch, designed to shed water. This had not been thrown together quickly. Someone had taken care over it. She stood there for a moment, and the question was simple enough. Where were they meant to go? She fetched a spade and a stiff-bristled broom from the barn and spent the next hour working carefully around and below the steps. The compacted soil came away in chunks, heavy with clay beneath a surface layer of finer material. At the 3rd step, she struck something with the spade that rang with a dull metallic tone. She brushed the earth back carefully and found a cast-iron fitting set into the stone, a socket, about 2 inches in diameter, mortared into the left-hand side of the staircase, just above the 3rd step. A handrail socket, the kind used when a staircase was expected to be descended regularly, by people carrying things in poor light. By the time the light began to fail, she had uncovered 12 steps in total. The bottom step met a stone-built wall. The wall was not a collapsed section of structure. It was solid, intact, and clearly deliberate, but the staircase descended toward it and stopped. There was a gap at the base, perhaps 4 inches of open space, between the bottom of the wall and the stone floor of what appeared to be a landing. Cold air moved through that gap. She could feel it on her hand when she reached down. Not damp, not foul, just cold, the steady, faintly mineral cold of earth that has never seen direct sunlight. There was something behind the wall. She went inside, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The following morning, she drove to the county archives in Shrewsbury. She had no particular expectation of finding anything useful, but she had made it a habit on this farm to look before she acted. There was a small but real possibility that whatever lay beneath the ground behind her barn was a listed structure, or at minimum, something that a conservation officer or local history society ought to know about before she began pulling at the stonework. The archivist, a patient, quietly knowledgeable woman named Ruth, spent 40 minutes with Margaret looking through tithe maps, historic ordnance survey sheets from the 1880s and 1890s, and a set of agricultural estate records from the mid-19th century that covered the particular cluster of farms in the valley. What they found confirmed that the area behind the barn had indeed been in use. The earliest map, surveyed in 1884, marked the location with a small symbol and a notation that was hard to decipher at first. Ruth studied it under a magnifying glass and then looked up with interest. Store, it read, and beside it, in cramped Victorian cartographer's notation, common, a common store, shared by more than one farm. Margaret returned home with a set of photocopied documents and a new question, considerably larger than the first one. She spent the weekend removing the sealed wall carefully, working from the base upward with a hammer and bolster, releasing the mortared stones one by one rather than knocking them through. It took most of Saturday. On Sunday morning, in full daylight, she descended the staircase properly for the first time. The space beneath was not enormous, but it was far larger than a simple root cellar. She measured it with a tape, approximately 22 feet long, 11 feet wide, with a ceiling height of just under 7 feet at the crown of the arched stone ceiling. The walls were constructed of the same local sandstone as the staircase, laid in courses with lime mortar. The floor was stone-flagged. At the far end, a series of shallow stone shelves had been built into the wall in 2 tiers, each approximately 18 inches deep. Along both longer walls, there were rusted iron hooks at regular intervals. She counted 9 on each side, set at a consistent height of about 5 feet from the floor. The hooks had been used repeatedly. The stone beneath each one was darkened and worn smooth, as though ropes or chains had been looped around them countless times over many years. But it was the ceiling that gave her the clearest indication of how sophisticated the structure truly was. At each end of the vault, set into the stone just below the springing line of the arch, were two narrow openings, 4 in total, lined with clay pipe and angled upward through the ground to the surface. Ventilation shafts. She found the surface exits later that afternoon, hidden beneath decades of vegetation along the hawthorn boundary, 4 small stone-capped vents, each about 3 inches across, barely noticeable at ground level. This was not a root cellar someone had scratched out with a spade on a wet afternoon. The ventilation system alone, designed to create a gentle cross-flow of cool air through the vault while preventing frost damage and damp, represented an understanding of underground temperature management that surprised her. The temperature inside was 8 degrees Celsius. She checked it with a thermometer. She checked it again 2 days later. It had not changed. The initials came next. On the underside of the second shelf tier at the far end of the vault, carved into the sandstone at approximately eye height if you were crouching to examine the lower shelf, were 4 sets of initials arranged in a rough column, THEWC, and J.P.R. Meredith. She photographed them and then, reasoning that they likely referred to categories of stored produce, T for turnips perhaps, E for something else, moved on. She was wrong about that. Ruth at the county archives recognized 2 of the names immediately when Margaret rang her the following week. The Pughs, a family that had farmed at Cwmni Wern, the next farm along the valley, were well documented in the parish records going back to the 1820s. The Merediths had farmed the other adjacent property, Higher Brackfen, until the early 20th century. The surname beginning with W almost certainly referred to the Wilton family, who had owned a small holding on the opposite side of the lane and were recorded in the 1891 census as mixed farmers. TH, Ruth suggested gently, might refer to a Hollis. Margaret spent a very quiet moment with that information. Her own family, the family that had farmed this land in one form or another for longer than she had ever thought to investigate. Her uncle had inherited the farm from his father, who had inherited it from his. She had never thought to trace it further than her grandfather's generation. She had never thought there was any particular reason to. The structure behind the barn had been built cooperatively, most likely during the latter half of the 19th century, by 4 neighboring farming families who had recognized that no single one of them had the resources to construct something like this alone. Together, they had pooled labor, material, and knowledge. The result was a shared underground storage vault designed to maintain a consistent cool temperature year-round, without ice, mechanical refrigeration, or any external energy input whatsoever. The flagged floor sloped almost imperceptibly toward a central drainage channel running the length of the vault, invisible until she got down and looked, which prevented moisture from accumulating and allowed the walls to breathe without becoming damp. The ventilation shafts drew on the natural pressure differential between the warmer air above and the cooler air below to create a slow, permanent circulation. The iron hooks had been used to hang cured meat, cheeses wrapped in cloth, and, according to a note she eventually found in a pocket diary from the 1890s belonging to a Meredith family descendant, occasional joints of salt beef during the summer months when spoilage was otherwise almost guaranteed. The descendant in question was a retired schoolteacher named Owen Meredith, 73 years old, who lived in a village 3 miles away. Margaret found him through the local history society, which had his contact details on file from a talk he had given several years earlier about Victorian farming in the valley. He came to the farm on a Tuesday afternoon in May, a lean, careful man with a walking stick and an expression of polite skepticism that shifted into something quite different when she led him down the 12 stone steps into the vault. He stood in the middle of the flagged floor and looked around slowly. He said nothing for a while. Then he moved to the far wall and ran his hand along the stone shelf. He crouched, slowly, and looked at the carved initials. He was quiet again for some time. "My grandmother mentioned this," he said finally. "I always assumed it was a figure of speech. She used to say her father knew where the cold was kept." He touched the R. Meredith with one finger, straightened up. He was a practical man. Owen said. They all were. There was nothing more to add to that, and Margaret didn't try. The vault had been sealed, she pieced together eventually, sometime in the late 1930s. The domestic refrigerator had begun to appear in rural Britain during the interwar years, still expensive and not universal, but visible enough to make the idea of a shared underground store feel increasingly like a relic of an older way of doing things. The original Meredith farm had been sold out of the family by 1938. The Wiltons had left the valley earlier still. The cooperative arrangement that had sustained the store for half a century quietly ceased when the people sustaining it were no longer present to sustain it. The entrance wall had been laid not from vandalism or secrecy, but as simple, practical sealing. Nobody wanted an open staircase in the ground to become a hazard to livestock. Someone, her instincts said her own grandfather, though she had no way to prove it, had laid the wall across the base of the steps and left it at that. Not hidden deliberately. Simply sealed, and then gradually buried beneath 40 years of the perfectly ordinary process by which a working farm generates waste and has no particular reason to move it. The hawthorn had grown around the vent caps. The moss had covered the steps. The gate and the drum and the harrow had settled into place on top of everything, and time had done the rest. By the end of June, Margaret had cleared the steps properly and repointed the staircase with lime mortar. She had a local stonemason assess the vault. He declared it structurally sound, with minor attention needed to 2 courses of the far wall, and had the drainage channel cleared and the ventilation shafts rotted through. The temperature inside was still 8 degrees. She began using the lower shelves to store cheese from the 3 dairy cows she kept, and hung 2 small joints of cured pork from a pair of the iron hooks as an experiment. Both kept perfectly, for 3 weeks, in conditions that would have required refrigeration in any other space on the farm. She stood at the top of the stone steps one evening in late summer, looking down into the cool and the clean dark, and thought about what had been required to build this, the agreement between neighbors, the shared calculation about cost and labor and benefit, the practical intelligence applied to a problem that every farm in the valley faced equally. No single family could have afforded to build it. Together, 4 families had built something that outlasted all of them. She had started the job in April, trying to fix a drainage problem. She had found, beneath 40 years of accumulated rubbish and 60 years of growing over, a piece of cooperative engineering that worked as well in the 21st century as it had in the 19th. Progress had made it unnecessary. Unnecessary, it turned out, was not the same as unintelligent. She descended the 12 steps into the cool, closed the new timber door she had fitted to the entrance, and went back to work.